Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Jason Reposa, founder and CEO of Good Feels. How you doing today, Jason?
Very good. Thank you very much, David.
All right, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. Finally, if you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. All right, Jason, let's get into it. Tell me how you broke into the cannabis industry.
In non-traditional ways, you might say, broke into the cannabis industry. That's an interesting way of asking. So basically, I was able to, I got laid off and basically said, what is my next thing going to be? You know what I mean? And then I just jumped. I was like, well, I've got this idea. Let me try it out, you know?
Mm-hmm. Where'd you get laid off?
I had a working prototype actually at that point, but.
Where were you laid off from?
So long story short, my last company got acquired back in 2019 that I was also the CEO of. And then we had a different opinion about how the company should be, run. Mm-hmm. And I was more in the idea of like, hey, I like to create new things all the time. Let's create something new. And they were kind of like, well, we bought you because you do this really well. So we're just going to keep on going down that path. And I was like, so we kind of just parted ways in that sense.
Okay.
So that was January 2020.
Okay. But you say that you had a working prototype. Was the working prototype a new beverage?
Basically, yes. Well, I originally started this technology based on the mix-in format. So what we call today now the beverage enhancer. But to that extent, I had already started, dabbling into beverages at that point.
Okay. What was it like after the acquisition and when you decided to spin off and do it again? I mean, I guess if you had already founded your another company, it wasn't so new this next time around.
No, I've started companies since I was like 7.
Oh, wow.
So I've always been that way. And I don't necessarily like to say serial entrepreneur. Actually, I can't even spell entrepreneur. But like, I don't know, it's the E's and the U's, they all get weird. But but basically, I feel every time I just follow where my brain goes. It's the simplest way to say it. Like, I'm like, oh, I'm like super curious what that is. And then I'll go and kind of figure that out.
Okay. So tell me about
this was not new.
Okay. So tell me about Good Feels.
So Good Feels is a cannabis beverage. We also have the beverage enhancer, the mix-in version where you can kind of, take your cannabis on the go, you might say. But the beverages themselves, the ready to drink format, we launched with 4 flavors. That's grapefruit, blood orange, raspberry apple, and black cherry. And depending on the day, my favorites kind of change because they're all delicious. And then those are ready to drink, right? You go to a dispensary, you pony up some cash to be able to get these bottles. We're in bottles, not cans. And then you can partake at your leisure. And then on the mix-in version, which I'm personally really excited about, I call the beverage enhancer as like my daily driver. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That's the one that I'm using on a daily basis. Like 5 o'clock rolls around, I'm dosing myself at that point with my beverage enhancer. And that one is, you have the ability to mix it into anything, right? So we have 2 flavors. One is lemon lime, which is like a squeeze of lemon in your drink. So you can take it, since it's water compatible, you can put it in anything water based. So people put it in their coffees, their tea. We've heard of people even putting it in their breakfast cereal. And specifically, not the lemon lime version, but the flavorless version, right? Mm-hmm. The flavorless version goes into anything kind of seamlessly. And then you can just do whatever you want. And it's more about, in those cases, since we're considered on the low dose side, it's about titration, if you're familiar with that scientific term, where you just kind of can level up and, leverage your way up to the point where your high is. And then you kind of just sit there and you're like, I'm good here. And you can kind of do it versus taking a traditional edible, waiting 45 minutes, and then figuring out if you're like way too low or like way too high. And then you go have a panic attack in your bed. You know what I mean? Like, so traditional edibles, there's almost zero, 10% of the time you get it just right. And the rest of the time you're just like, Is it too low or is it too high? Whereas this is more of like that levered up approach where you can kind of settle in whatever your high comfort level is, and you kind of just can, dose yourself a little bit as you go to keep you at that level, or you basically just stop and then you will, become sober at that point.
No, I'm definitely familiar with the panic attack in the bed, and just the other day had one chocolate, great experience. Next day, same chocolate, panic attack in the bed.
Yeah, and there's biological reasons for that too. But this is all different. This is all new technology. It's only come out in the last few years. So, but traditionally prepared edibles are kind of, like I said, I didn't come in through traditional means. That's when you asked that first question, right? I was just like, I'm not a traditional cannabis user. I discovered this after I had a medical issue. And then I started to dabble with like different technologies. And I was just like, oh, that's new. That's interesting. My brain was like, what's that about? And so I reverse engineered it and I figured out my own formulations. And then eventually got to the point where I was like, oh, this is the future. This is where the future is. This is not like traditional edibles, like, like I said, wait 45 minutes, potentially have a panic attack.
Mm-hmm. No, it's, and I guess panic attack is an exaggeration. It's more of a recognition that it was time for bed.
Yeah, exactly. Like only way you're going to get past this is to go to sleep. And unfortunately for us who have children, it's like, you don't want to be in that situation ever, because you're like, okay, if something happens in the middle of the night and I got to deal with some child issue, whether it's a fever or a bedwetting or some, just like, sometimes you just can't deal with. I mean, I've been there myself, and many people also have those same stories, which is why, I'm really excited about our particular technology, which allows you, the fast onset, but it's also just like keeping you at the level you want to, and then just kind of like quickly coming off if you need to as well.
So in previous enterprises, had you done food manufacturing or beverage manufacturing? Did you have experience with it, or were you sort of starting at ground zero?
I'm a technologist. I create technologies, and not in food and bev, not in CPG. I mean, I've done a little bit of CPG work through my days and being the CTO of an ad agency. But on the technical side, I've been in zeros and one land for 25 years at this point, right? So I've been a programmer. And so the reason why I went down this path was because I think a lot of people feel this way who come from that industry of technology, where they want to create something tangible. They want to actually create something that you can hold in your hand. Because if I had my way and I didn't have a wife and 3 children, I probably would just spend all day in my head in front of a computer. But at the end of the day, you think to yourself, well, what's my lasting impact? And having something tangible you could hold in your hands is extremely attractive to me. And that's also one of the reasons why I went into this, is because I had an idea, I'd gotten laid off, and it helped me with my own medical issues that I was going through. And I was like, there's something here that I have to see it through using my own funds, whatever it takes. I got to see this all the way through.
What were some of the medical issues that it was helping you with?
Oh, in my particular case, it was primarily around the TMJ, that whole muscle structure, jaw. So I suffer from, when I have stress, I really hold it in my neck. Like I'm like bunched up in a ball up here. And like that translates eventually. I was able to finally loosen up and, but basically I had crazy bouts of inflammation in my head, to the point where they were shooting needles of ozone in my skull, basically to remove the inflammation. And nothing was working. And I was like, this is insane. Like, how is none of this helping? Right. And I would go to doctors and dentists, all the traditional, medicine routes. And I was like many people in my situation, I was like, I gotta try something else. Like, I just have to try something else. And eventually I was just like, oh, cannabis, that's like a thing. That's what people use this for, is inflammation and stress and, anti-anxiety, which is what I was prescribed eventually when I got my medical card. So those were my founding issues, that eventually when I got to cannabis, I was like, oh, this actually is wonderful. I was like, that now it makes sense, because I hadn't touched cannabis in 20 years. Right. And so eventually you have that crippling issue and you're like, I can't open my mouth anymore. I literally could not physically open my mouth more than like a half an inch to an inch. And I had to try something new. And eventually cannabis ended up working. And I was like, this is amazing, right? Now it didn't solve the whole thing. I had to go through other practitioners and stuff like that, and, different wellness routines, et cetera. Anti-inflammatory, like turmeric and all this other stuff, right? I like kind of heavily loaded a lot of this stuff, but cannabis was a big component of that because that allowed me to sleep at night stress-free, right? Like I wasn't grinding anymore at night, which is what the cause was.
So did you say the company was founded in January 2020?
We didn't. No, I got laid off in 2020.
Oh,
I got laid off in January 2020. August 2020 was the date that I founded the company.
Did you start on your own, or did you assemble a team to get it off the ground?
Well, I mean, a mix, right? So I started, starting companies. Like I said, I've done it my entire life. So this was for me. This was like, it's like the most exciting part of starting a company. For me, anyways, is like, hey, let's go as far as I can by myself, and let's, when I have to bring that body in, I'll bring that body in. And, whether it's a freelance or something like that, like eventually get started. But so I founded it in August of 2020, and I engaged with a few freelancers to do design concepts and logos and stuff like that. And the logo as it is today is just a slight tweak of what it originally started with, which is kind of cool to say. And then, but my first hire wasn't until May of 2021, official full-time hire.
So where's your manufacturing facility? Where are you guys based?
We're based in the lovely town of Medway, Massachusetts. Medway is actually my hometown also. And I am lazy and I don't want to travel more than 10 minutes to work. So I was like, it's got to be in this town. And literally, if you're familiar with any of the cannabis regulations in Massachusetts, and, I don't know how it works in other states again, but in Massachusetts, they have something called a host community agreement, which basically means that you have to have a contract with the town to operate in that town. But before you can have that contract to operate in the town, you have to have a signed lease in your hands. And then the towns, basically the way they vote, say you can only exist in this one area in town. And typically they're industrial parks, right? Relegated to the strip clubs and the, whatever else, like all this other things just go in industrial parks, including industrial reasons, right? But basically the town kind of dons like these Christians, these parts of town as like the only place you can exist as a cannabis operator. Therefore, the landlords, every time they hear about a cannabis company coming through, say, hey, instead of like $8 a square foot, it's $15 a square foot, right? Mm-hmm. And that number actually did happen to me in one conversation. It was literally over a period of one conversation. Once they found out we were cannabis, they practically doubled our lease. Right. Anyways, long story short, I was able to secure this only one space left in the industrial park in my hometown. And through phone calls, through a million other people, just hustling, just trying to find anybody who will talk to me about property. I eventually found this one spot, not even using a broker. I just called up the dude. He was like on Craigslist. He was like, hey, you know what I mean? Just I was one of those Craigslist ads, and I just called him out on it. And he was like, cannabis? Yeah, that's fine. We don't care. And I was like, all right, great. No doubling of nothing. It was just like, yeah, we'll charge you a basic normal rate.
Once you secured the facility, how did you go about purchasing some of the equipment that you knew you were going to need to make the product?
Yeah, equipment is super interesting. So I built a bottling machine in my basement. So I already had an idea of like what it needed to be. With that said, I did hire a procurement person to be able to secure like pieces of equipment that it was over my head, right? There's pros and cons to doing that. In our case, it was mostly okay, but there was definitely some unfortunate side effects from it. But we ended up with a bottling machine that was ridiculously overpowered for our space. Mm. But at the same time, it is what it is. I'm kind of, I'm very frugal with my money, but at the same time, I'm very trusting. And I'm just like, hey, I don't know CPG. I've never made a drink before or any type of beverage. Like, let me go find somebody who's an expert in that and use their brain to be able to secure these things, right? I trusted that person to do that, and that person actually didn't. Like, they had to hire somebody else to do it. They like could talk a good game, you might say, and then all of a sudden they had to find somebody else to actually do the work. And then that, like, things didn't get translated right. We're in stubby bottles, stubby glass bottles, but the machine that they sent us was built for like long necks, for instance. And then all of a sudden we've got to do all this reconfiguring of the machine. We're hiring other consultants to come in to fix those mistakes. It shipped with like missing pieces. It was like all over the place.
I was gonna ask about those unfortunate side effects, but it sounds like the entire machine in general wound up being one big headache.
Oh yeah, absolutely, a huge headache. It's working beautifully now, and we have a head brewer and a facilities person who are like really maintaining it and making sure it's continued to be right. But yeah, towards the end of 2021, just as we were getting our final license, it was like, are we gonna be able to put out a bottle? Because this machine is still not working right. So it was a bit scary leading up to the end of 2021, whether or not we were going to even get a bottle out, and to the point where we actually ended up getting a secondary bottling machine on the side because we need counter pressure. It's carbonated. So like we ended up buying a simple like 4-head machine just to be able to like, fill 4 bottles at a time, just to have something going, which was, a sixth of the speed of this giant bottling machine that we have. So the bottling machine that we have can do 1,200 bottles an hour, right? So it's not the biggest machine in the world, but if we can get it to that level, we're obviously, sales are fantastic,
Speaking of sales, right now, are you only available in Massachusetts, or do you have distribution to other areas?
We're available only in Massachusetts. We have spoken to a few companies. Some companies have reached out to us. We've depending on the publication, typically you hear about like those big trade publications on BevNet, for instance. Like when we hit BevNet, I got a flood of probably like a dozen producer partners out in other states, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, the 3 that we're interested in, that were like, can we get your beverage into these states? And I was like, yeah, let's talk, because in we're dedicated Massachusetts. We're 100% born and raised Massachusetts people. So like we plant our flag proudly in Massachusetts. So we wouldn't necessarily go through that whole licensing process in New Jersey or New York or Connecticut. For us, it would be partnering with somebody to co-pack or co-manufacture our products.
What's the company size right now?
12. 12. Yes. Yep. I just became an employee. That's why it was hard to answer. I just paid myself. I just had my first paycheck like the other day for finally.
Well, the one thing that I heard is that while you have 12 people, is that, it sounds like you pay a pretty fair wage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Our starting wage is $20 an hour. We're going to increase that. We have to figure out with inflation. We're definitely going to bump that up a bit. And, we have benefits. We're trying to be. It was never about the money when I started the company. It was because my brain was like, that's so cool. Let me try to figure that out. And when I figured it out, by the time I realized how much of an impact this was going to have, I had already hired a few people, and then they were telling me how much of an impact it's going to have. And they believed in everything from the start. Right. And that's one of the things. We have no problem recruiting people. Like we get 200 applications for every job posting we put out there. But if you speak about something passionately, you can get those people, right? However, in my particular case, mentally, I was like, okay, I've got now a few employees. Now it's real. I've got other people's families and their livelihoods at stake here. So then I was like, from starting a little MVP, which is the tech term, minimum viable product, which is just like, what's the core idea behind this? And let's use this minimum amount of money to launch it. From that starting kind of kernel seed of like the idea into what it has become today, it's due to 100% to the team because they brought it to another level. My philosophy is I hire people who are smarter than me, right? And you pay for that ultimately at the end of the day, right? And then you reward them, whether that's through options or bonuses and stuff like that, which we've already done both of those actually.
What happened to the old bottling machine? Is it still in your basement?
Yes, it is. And I had to use it the other day. We were going to a conference, a local conference, NECAN in Boston. And my production director looks at me and she says, do you want us to like make product for sale? Because people are like buying this at a good clip and we could be filling these tanks with like finished product, which we can sell. Or would you like to fill it with like a product that you're just uninfused product that you're giving away? And I was like, all right, just go ahead and yes, fulfill all the orders. Please keep on filling the tanks up with infused samples. But we wanted to bring uninfused samples to this conference. And so I had to put the bottling machine back back together again, practically, because, it's a basement. And so I actually had started already creating the second version of this. At one point I was thinking to myself, man, I could create like a whole bottling line myself, and then sell that as a separate manufacturing company, because the second machine I was working on was really, really cool. But I never finished it because everything else kind of took off with this bottling machine. But yeah, I had to turn the old one on, the V1 version of this, made with Home Depot parts and Nick Master parts, and every little gasket and every little pipe fitting, and going from 1/4 inch NTP or NPT to like 1/4 inch flare to like whatever, like all the HD, all the Teflon tape in the world. I was covered in this stuff, you know what I mean, to get this thing together. I turned it back on and I produced another 300 bottles, uninfused blood orange samples to give out into the conference. So
what
we had something to give away.
Yeah, no, and it sounds like it was just fun to turn it back on again.
Oh yeah, it totally was. I had my kids helping me. I mean, I'm kind of like
Yeah.
that. I'm like, hey, get down here in the basement. You're helping me sanitize, take these bottles, sanitize and clean them, and set them all up for me. And I'll do the bottling part, but like you guys got to help me too. So I put 2 of my oldest kids on the job that day, and I paid them like $20 each or something.
How old are your kids?
12 and 10 and 5.
Oh,
The
really?
5-year-old, I was like, you're okay. She brought in a few bottles. I didn't pay her for that though.
Outside of the bottling machine, what other equipment did you have to bring in house?
Basically everything. So we do the emulsification even in-house. So we buy the core ingredients from third parties, but we do all the mixing and blending and flavors and all this other stuff in-house. And, all the equipment that we have is traditional, something you find in a brew house, right? So we have a labeler, we have a bottler, we've got the bright tanks, we've got the crazy amount of, inch and a half tri-clamp fittings on everything with hoses and all this other stuff, and centrifugal pumps, as well as the other pump there. I can't remember, the diaphragm pump, like, all the traditional stuff you'd see in like basically a brew house, except for without having to do like a mash or anything like that. There's no cones and stuff like that. We all have flat bottom brights here.
What is your approach to sourcing raw materials?
Domestic is preferable in almost every situation. I feel like, I'm a huge proponent of finding things as local as possible. That's not always the case. You can't always do it 100% perfectly, because US manufacturing, every time I get a quote from a packaging company, for instance, I just got a sample the other day, a box they sent me. And they sent me like some garbage, and I was just like, what is this? And it came from Hong Kong, and I was just like, yeah, okay. I don't know why they sent me this package, because it was like not what I'd asked for, but you get a lot of that where it's just like everything coming from China, and it's like, it is what it is. But at the same time, we're always looking for domestic sources. So if there are domestic sources out there for packaging or for equipment and stuff like that, we're definitely interested in looking at them. Now that we know a lot more, and now that I've got a head brewer and people who can do facilities and HVAC and stuff like that, we're much better equipped now to be able to, really put something nice together. And so that's something we will be needing shortly, because we are in the process of building our second facility, which is in the next town over.
Do you need a second facility just to ramp up production scale?
Basically, yes. And so, like I said, the machine that we have today does 1,200 bottles an hour, but in its current space, it could probably only do like 600 to 800, maybe. You know what I mean? Like it could probably get to 600, but 800 might be a little bit too far off. The if we put it into just a bigger space, we'll be able to get a much closer to 1200. So just by putting it in a different space, we're going to be able to unleash this throughput a little bit better. And the same thing with the labeler, right? The labeler can do like 1,800 bottles an hour or something ridiculous. Like we just can't run it at those speeds because of the space, because even getting a pallet of bottles in this space is hard for us right now. And so we've got more production people than anything because there's a lot of manual production costs that we have to deal with right now. And we don't have a depalletizer or repalletizer because there's no space for these pieces of equipment.
Oh, so it's more of a logistics issue, not necessarily an issue with, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So with the sales growth that we're already seeing, like we're going to need a new facility anyways, because we're probably going to have to introduce a second bottling line. But at the same time, it's one of the situations where we need space for more tanks, for instance, right? We've got 4 15 barrels we're filling, and our vault size, I thought it was a pretty decent sized vault, but again, I'm new to these things. I've never had to design a space before. Worked with my architect really closely on that. We went through probably 3 versions of the space before I finally settled on let's just maximize for 2 things: vault and processing. Other than that, the production space has to be the biggest. Vault space has to be the second biggest. And everything else, I don't care. Like, I don't care if a person has a desk to sit at. You know what I mean? Like, because we don't have that much space. But the second facility, we're going to have so much. It's 5, almost 6 times bigger than we're in today. So we'll be able to put in 8, 12, bright tanks. Maybe we'll start going up to 40 barrels. I don't know, but we have the ceiling height for it and everything. So it's a pretty cool idea to be able to have like that kind of like that future kind of growth strategy that we're trying to play into.
What is your methodology when it comes to sourcing ingredients?
On the ingredient side, I'm vegan, so it's a vegan company just by default. We don't really say it much, but as far as raw ingredient stuff, again, domestic is key. We're obviously looking for only natural sources. So all of our flavors are basically the essential oils of the fruit, for instance. So our black cherry, for instance, is like a really dark purple when we get it. You know what I mean? It's squeezed cherry juice, basically. And so, but we use it in such low quantities, it's still considered 0 sugar, 0 calorie. But so things like that are really important for us. I would say, we're not trying to add a bunch of synthetic anything into this. So whole natural fruits, as well as, even the water that we use has been filtered as well as UV sanitized. So we take quality control is really important to us. And so we want a repeatable product over and over again. And that comes to holding our suppliers also to a high standard. So every time we change something in the batch, anytime there's a different batch change on their end and we see a different batch number, we say, okay, let's run the tests again. Let's do quality control on that one, because that lemon lime might be different than the last lemon lime they sent us, right? So we're always quality controlling all the way through the whole process.
What about from a THC perspective?
Oh, that's a great question. This is a cannabis conversation, right? So there's 2 components to that, and with a big kind of overarching theme. The 2 components that we look at is in our diversity plan, we put a certain percentage allocated to sourcing ingredients such as THC from other minority business enterprises like myself, or social equity or economic empowerment operators. And there are a number in the state. And so we, obviously number 1 is to try to source from people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. The second part of that is that there's interesting thing. I get an email every other day from somebody in the industry being like, hey, I've got fresh frozen. I've got, I've got 1,000 pounds of trim and smalls. I've got like massive quantities. I'm like, we don't do extraction here though. We can't buy, again, the towns kind of control what's going on here. We can't do any extraction because they don't want any smell in my town. So we had to hire an engineer and put together a report that said THC distillate at a certain percentage, like 90, 95%, whatever, does not contain any smell. unless you heat it up and do all kinds of crazy stuff to it, then it potentially could have like a smell to it. But for the most part, it's fairly odorless, right? And our town holds us to a really high standard with those things. So we only source distillate. We don't actually source any of the plant itself. So that's part of it. But the second part of this really is about the idea of working with operators who are going to be producing consistent results over and over again. Because again, for us, it's quality control. Mm-hmm. Our beverages, based on our research, and we surveyed over 250 people. We've held focus groups, one-on-one interviews. Nobody in our demographic that we're targeting wants to taste weed in their beverage, right? So it has to be super clear, super clean. Because it's a drink, right? Mm-hmm. There are some people out there that would argue with that and say, like, I want it to taste like weed, and that's you. I don't, but you're not my target audience, right? So like, that's cool, and you do you, and I'm not gonna judge anybody for wanting to even smoke it. It's not who I am. I'm not gonna start judging people for doing things that I wouldn't do, right?
Right.
With that said, I'm looking at it from the simple fact of the matter is, in this industry in Massachusetts, the price of THC distillate has dropped so much because, like I said, somebody was trying to unload 1,000 pounds of trim and smalls on me the other day. And I'm like, I can't do anything with that.
Right.
But there's plenty of people who can because they've got extraction equipment. But when I first started this journey, we were looking at distillate prices of over $40,000 a liter or a kilo. Mm-hmm. Now, I got a quote for $13,000 for 91% THC with a total cannabinoid content of over, I think it was like 97% total cannabinoids or something crazy. $13,000 for a kilo, where it was $40,000 18 months ago.
Yeah,
right.
That's incredible.
So my margins are only going to get better, which is great. But I would love to see some of those numbers translate to the consumer too.
Right.
You know what I mean? At the end of the day, I want people to drink Good Feels all the time, everywhere. You know what I mean? Like for me, I just want to share it as much as I can, right? To the point where, I'd be practically giving it away if I could, if it meant that I was able to survive. Because again, it was never about the money, right? Mm-hmm. It was about getting a tangible product on a shelf. And that was the first step. And we've done that. Now our second step, which I'm not going to reveal too many plans for, but we've got 5-6 other products we're working on right now that I think are going to blow the doors off kind of what's acceptable today. With that said, the price of distillate coming down so much, I feel for the cultivators because I'm seeing properties in Massachusetts pop up online for sale now, right? Yeah. There's a building right next to me that went through all the permitting process except for the licensing process. They went through all the permitting process. It was just on sale. It's like 100,000 square feet, building and real estate and everything. I think it's 6.9 million, and they've gone through all the local permitting process at this point. So it's interesting to see these properties like pop up now. And if I wouldn't want to be a cultivator, and I've told cultivator friends of mine, I feel for you right now because yes, you might have the best premium flower, and that craft connoisseur is never going away. But for edible manufacturers, for beverage manufacturers, you're just buying this. You're just using distillate, right? It doesn't have. It could come from trim. It can. We're just talking about trichomes. We're not talking about Anyways, I digress. I could go on for a long time about.
Do you have fears that the bottom could drop out of the cannabis industry in Massachusetts?
Well, the consumer is still very much in control. At the end of the day, it doesn't seem like it today because of prices, but the consumer is going to be there. And as long as there's a legal market for it, if the bottom isn't going to drop out, I would say, if anything, the challenges come in with two things: 280E, right? So a lot of what the consumer doesn't understand is the fact that we've got to pay these crazy tax rates, effectively like 40% or something ridiculous. And then on top of that, the regulations make it a huge burden to be able to be licensed, right? So we have in our 1,900 square foot facility, which I can hear people laughing on the video now. We have 26 cameras, I think. And so that's more than that's a camera for less than for every less than 100 square feet. So think about that. That's insane.
Yeah.
With that said, the burden is on the operators. The money was in the very beginning, the money was there. That was cannabis 1.0. Let's grow as much as possible and then we'll sell it all, right? Didn't work out so well. Now we're in 2.0. New products are starting to trickle out, being like, whether it's a beverage or fast acting edibles or whatever, right? Some of these things are starting to come out, right? There's a lot of celebrities coming in, stuff like that. A lot of celebrities are probably going to get burnt, or they're just not going to sell as well. It's just that, celebrity endorsements are weird in Massachusetts. You have to, there's like special like ways you can get around it, basically, of like, doing an ad in that sense of, putting a celebrity on something. With that said, like, celebrities only get you so far. People are, value is everything for especially Massachusetts cannabis consumers. Half the time I talk to a Massachusetts cannabis consumer, they're like, I'm just going to go to Maine and buy it because it's half the price or whatever. Not a half, but like it's exaggerated a little bit. But so I don't think the consumer will drive the conversation. They'll be in the driver's seat eventually. Right now, it still reeks of like the old legacy operators a little bit and MSOs that are coming in and being like, hey, can't we just plant a dispensary in this town and make $1 million a month? Not anymore. I've heard horror stories on that too, being like they're only pulling like less than $5,000 a day, and it's just like, that's not great, it's not great.
Right. Do you have plans for celebrity endorsements, or what is your marketing strategy when it comes to going to market?
So celebrity is one of those weird things that we haven't quite figured out the approach there. There are certain hometown celebrities that we really love and I cherish as like that hero story from my hometown and all this other stuff, right? I love that stuff.
Yeah.
The regulations make things a little bit hard. With that said, there's, as far as marketing goes in general, I would say there are some celebrities that I've kind of been like, yeah, it'd be really cool to have that person represent us. Different generation, you know what I mean? It's not like I'm targeting that 21-year-old who's just got their, they finally walked into their first dispensary legally. I'm talking about like the 35, 40-year-olds, et cetera, who like grew up with certain things. And I think some people are doing this okay. But certain celebrities kind of like will tap into that pretty easily, which I feel is a pretty good tactic. I just don't know how we're going to do it. But more specifically on the marketing and advertising side, the regulations kind of hinder what we do. So I think a lot of the existing advertising strategies that have been done in Massachusetts they've already been done. There's nothing interesting in them. With that said, there are a number of new things that we're actually putting together that I think are going to be more impactful. The regulations play a huge role in this, right? Because it has to be 21 plus audience, at least 85%, right? How do you measure 85% when you go to like an event, a concert? Like maybe you can figure out 85%. Like, so there's a lot of those advertise and like, I don't how are the billboard companies doing? I mean, they have some demographic data, but it's like hard to even know. So like a lot of the strategies we wouldn't do. We're a manufacturer. We're not a dispensary. If you're a dispensary and you say, hey, get off at exit 72 to go to this dispensary, I get that. That makes sense. That's like McDonald's advertising, like that. Oh, you're hungry? Go here. Right. But for a brand, I just don't see the value and stuff like that, because yes, you could get good feels at a number of different dispensaries and, we might be able to partner with the dispensary to get people into them. But for us, we're talking about a core tribe. I keep on getting corrected on that. A core group of users, right, that are preaching good feels to people, right? I get people contacting me several times a day saying, your seltzer blows everybody out of the water. It tastes so much better than everything that's out there. Thank you so much. We had a Michelin trained chef respond and said, your blood orange is by far the best tasting seltzer I've ever had.
Oh,
I'm like, this is random people, right?
Right.
So it's great to hear a lot of that stuff that we're doing things right. Because again, we surveyed, we sent out samples, on a few samples to hundreds of people, and we narrowed it down to these 4 flavors. It doesn't mean we'll have other things coming out, of course, on beverages, but that's just our starter four. But as far as marketing goes, we're talking a lot of that. You know, I'm not going to say viral marketing because that was the kind of ad agency world that I was in, but
Right.
more of, just people talking.
Yeah,
That's
word of mouth.
that's what we want. Yeah. Word of mouth is huge. But part of that is stigma drives a lot of those conversations because it's not like you want people to know. Right.
Okay.
So there's a lot of that normalization that still has to occur to really get word of mouth going. But, I had a friend send me a picture of a mocktail that he put together. Actually, I get one of these today too. A mocktail that somebody puts together and be like, hey, I just got a hold of the beverage enhancer. Check out this drink I just made. And they share like the recipe with me and everything. Right. And I love it. So you've got these core group of people and they're telling their friends about it, which is fantastic, which I was not expecting because I think the stigma, in my opinion, as part of the Dare generation is still kind of heavy in my specific demographic.
Who is the hometown hero that is like your get?
Ooh, should I give this up? That's an interesting question. I'll tell you. Here's the way I look at it. There are there are people out there like a Doug Flutie. I'm not going to say Doug Flutie because I don't think that's a good fit. But there are people like that who are just like, they mean so much to Massachusetts that you're like, I got to get that person. We're talking, and of course, other people have done that. Like Paul Pierce has his own brand. There's a few other Massachusetts kind of ish people, although Paul Pierce, I don't know if he's from Massachusetts. Obviously, he played for the Celtics for a long time. But so there are certain people who do have that kind of that pull for a specific audience. But again, we're not talking about pre-rolls. Right. We're talking about the future. We're talking about getting people who wouldn't necessarily be in cannabis to come into cannabis. And therefore, we're talking about a different type or style of celebrity, which is not somebody who's just coming out being like, hey, I actually smoked my entire NBA career or whatever. I'm not saying NBA, but it could be any sport. Right.
Right.
And then coming out and being like, hey, I did smoke behind the scenes. Nobody knew it. And when I got drug tested, it was clean. And so like, now really coming out and I'm saying like, hey, here are my pre-rolls and these are the stamped pre-rolls from XYZ, celebrity. That's not what we're trying to do, right? We're not just trying to stamp something that already exists. We're trying to say like, what's the actual synergy here that we know that is going to be impactful, A, for our demographic, but B, also something meaningful because again, it's about that passion. And there's certain celebrities that have that passion. You can kind of stand and if they put their name on it, they stand behind.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any issues when it came to packaging? You had mentioned some of the troubles that you had with the bottling machine. What about some of the regulations and restrictions when it comes to the actual packaging?
We partnered really early with a fairly well-renowned designer. And so we knew going into it that if, we were so happy to get this person that everything they put out there was so good. It was so hard to find an actual label that we all could agree on because they were all so good. Mm-hmm. So for us, where we ended up going, we get compliments on it all the time. So the design process by far was the easiest. Picking a vendor to actually print the labels was a little bit harder. And I'm glad we ended up where we were. I still get an email once a week from a label company being like, hey, I see you're in market now. Let's talk about labels. And I'm like, I kind of already had that conversation. I'm not really open to that conversation again. But as far as other packaging stuff, we're still developing new packaging as far as like cartons and stuff like that. A lot of this is kind of that scrappy underdog process where we're the underdogs by far. Like they have I didn't know Levy existed or High Five existed when I started. I had no clue. I was just like, hey, something's happening out in the West Coast that they're doing stuff like this. So I took my beverage enhancer and I was like, let me just make the ready to drink version too, and that's how I kind of bridged that gap. And then all of a sudden Levy had come out and I was just like, oh, there's like a VC backed or not VC. I don't want to put words in their mouth. I mean, it was a investment backed kind of company coming out in like a 5,000 square foot facility. I was like, oh man, like they're going to hit it hard. And they proved it out for everybody, which was fantastic. And there was fear back then. And I spoke to another operator about this. There was fear back then. If they didn't get it right, it would completely destroy the beverage industry in Massachusetts. Because if you put out an inferior product, people aren't going to buy it. And then they're going to look at you and be like, I've had seltzer before. I don't want that anymore. Right. So there was a real fear back in 2021 that I was like, I hope their sales are coming in. And they were. And I was like, fantastic. Now that they're the number one in Massachusetts, and they have basically since they've started, they've only been number one. We always are that scrappy underdog. And so from our perspective, we're always thinking to ourselves, what's the scrappy way to do this? Right. What I always say is the GEG, right? The good enough gang. Like that's good. Like 85% is good enough. We don't have to go through committees and design processes for like 3 more months to figure out if this is the one that everybody resonates with. I don't care. Being in market is better to me sometimes than going through a long process. However, we are treating this as a proper CPG company with, and I've been, again, hiring people smarter than me that have educated me on the branding process and running a proper CPG company, which allows us to not release things too rushed. So on the packaging side, I'm kind of just like, can't we just like get a stamp from Vistaprint and start stamping like boxes? You know what I mean? Like, why do I have to pay this dye fee and have an MOQ of a 10,000? You know what I mean? Like, I can literally go off at Amazon right now, get like something off Amazon and just start stamping it myself because somebody needed it tomorrow. You know what I mean? And then going back and be like, okay, now let's do it the real way. So there's definitely a lot of scrappiness still in this company.
Are you only sold in dispensaries, or do you do any e-commerce?
Only in dispensaries. We have a path forward for that for e-commerce, but we're just not sure we're going to release it just yet. But yeah, so there are ways to do it, and we have technology that allows us to kind of bridge the gap from dispensary. So you don't have to go into dispensaries for it, but there is again, it's regulations, it's software technology, things like that. I'm very familiar with. Like, we have the ability to do it. Whether or not we're going to release it or not, I don't know yet. And it's prototype. It's not like a fully fleshed out product either. But
before we get out of here, is there anything else that we might have left out, or anything in particular you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows about Good Feels?
I mean, the biggest thing when it comes to equipment, especially, is you got to know who's going to service your equipment, because that's one of the things that really blew up for us was the fact that like we couldn't get somebody out for like 6 weeks to look at our machine, because you just have to have that trust. You have to have the trust, but you also have to have something in writing that says, when I get this big piece of equipment, there's somebody coming the next day to set it up for me, right? Or whatever that agreement is. So as far as equipment goes, like, especially when you're making a big investment like we did in bottling and all that other stuff, like knowing that the vendor themselves has your back and is willing to like put the work in to be able to make sure you get set up is huge. With that said, don't be afraid to build something yourself. Like, I do that all the time, because there's always a little something that's going to make our team 10% faster. And I'll go home, I'll design it on my little MacBook. I'll design something in Fusion 360 or whatever, some CAD program. I'll 3D print something, and I'll say, the next day I'll be like, here. And they'll take it and they'll say, almost fits, because everything, it's a little bit off that first time. But like, I'll do it a few times. And so like, that's what happened with our forehead filler. Our forehead filler had like a 3-inch gap because it was built for long necks and not stubbies. So I had to build a whole platform, extra platforms for this little filler that we have just as a backup that will actually like raise up everything just right. You know what I mean? Because before they were literally holding it up for counter pressure. And I'm like, no. Like, I'll make you a stand. Like, simple things like that though. And knowing how your production team is working allows you to have that idea in your head to be able to make things a little more efficient, right? And you hope people would bring that to you, but it doesn't always happen. You just look at it and be like, why would you do it that way? Like, I can literally bend a piece of metal, stick it under there, and you'll get that much faster, right?
Well, Jason, thank you very much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to learn more about Good Feels, and I look forward to seeing where the company goes from here.
Thank you so much, David. Pleasure.
All right. Well, for Jason Reposa, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and I always botch the ending. So I'll say, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. Finally, if you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. All right. Now, for Jason Reposa, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.